Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Rivera, and today I'm going to be persuading you in the belief that architecture should be considered a professional career. So, when people think about professional careers, they usually think about, jobs like doctors, lawyers, engineers, or nurses. But recently there's been an issue where architecture wasn't treated that way as other professional careers, you know. So even though architecture takes years of school, training, exams, and just real responsibility, this topic matters to me because I'm studying architecture and I know it's not just about drawing buildings or making things look nice. Architecture affects, real people, real buildings, and the way people use those spaces every day. The problem is that, architecture can sometimes be treated like it's not a professional career, and that makes people misunderstand how much work and responsibility goes into it. And the solution is that architecture should be considered and recognized as a professional career because it requires, serious education, licensing, and responsibility for the public safety in general. One of my cited sources from the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, quoted that the Department, of Education final rule excluded that architecture degrees, you know, from being classified as a professional, program under the federal student loan. So to me, that's like a problem because, architecture is still a licensed profession and students go through a lot even to get close to becoming architects. So first, architecture should be considered a professional career because, it requires serious education and lots of training. Like architecture students, they don't just learn how to sketch a building. They learn, design, structure, building codes, construction documents, materials, history, and how people use those spaces. Architecture, also takes a lot of time because students have to learn how to solve problems and explain, their ideas clearly. It's a field where creativity matters, but you also have to understand like the technical side of buildings. And that's why it shouldn't be treated just like an art class or a simple, design hobby. Second, architecture should be considered a professional career because architects have to become licensed, and a person who graduates, they can't just automatically call themselves a licensed architect. Um, and one of my cited sources from NCARB basically quoted, becoming an architect usually includes education, experience, and examination. And that means, a person has to go through school, work, and basically practice the career under professionals and gain experience and pass exams before they can fully, practice as an architect. One of my visuals would be kind of like showing this. So this is basically an architectural stamp, which is like a good example of why architecture should be, considered as and be seen as a professional career, because it's not just about, anyone being able to use it. It's something that is very important to a licensed architect. So, a licensed architect has to go through school, experience, exams, state requirements, before they can even, stamp the drawings. So to me, this shows that architecture isn't just about, drawing, buildings. It's a real responsibility. And because of that, the stamp means that, architects is taking, professional responsibility for all the work they've been doing. So, finally, architecture should be considered, because it affects the public and buildings aren't just objects. People live, they work, they study, and gather inside them. Another cited source that I had was from the U.S. Bureau of Labor, and I've used this quote before, but it's basically explaining kind of like how what architects do, and it's architects plan and design houses, factories, office buildings, and other structures. So architects are involved in places where people use every day, and if a building is badly planned, unsafe, or even inaccessible, um, it can affect people's lives and everyday lives. So architects also work with engineers, contractors and clients to make sure the building can be designed and built correctly. And this is why, architecture is more than just, making something look nice. It connects, design, safety, communication and technical knowledge. Some people may think, that architecture is only about being creative or just, all out creativity, but it's also about responsibility. An architect has to think about how people are going to enter a building, how they move through it, how the building, needs to meet codes, and how the building can actually be, built. And so it's not as easy as just designing something without having proper knowledge behind it. You have to have some kind of like, practice and just like a professional um, mind and doing all these, buildings and trying to stamp all these, blueprints. Not everybody can, put the stamp on some drawings. You have to go to school through it. You have to, actually um, start, taking all that knowledge you got from school and applying it into real world. And so to just kind of like summarize everything, um, the reason why I believe, architecture should be considered a professional career is because it requires, serious education, like I said, and it requires licensing and it affects the public safety and, real buildings. So the problem is that, when architecture is left out of the professional recognition, people may not understand how much work and responsibility the career really has. The solution is to like recognize, architecture in the same way as other professional careers that are being recognized as well. Architecture isn't just about drawing and not just about making buildings look nice. It takes, the career that, takes knowledge, training, responsibility, and years of just preparing yourself. And as someone who's, studying architecture, I believe that it should be respected, as a professional career because architects help, shape the spaces, people use every day. So, yeah, thank you.